Get your hands off that keyboard, Vance. You are fired, effective immediately. Pack your things and leave within 10 minutes or security will escort you out. Oliver Miller's voice echoed off the concrete walls of the server room, his face flushed red with unearned authority. I looked at the security clearance notification flashing on my screen, then slowly turned around to face the 27-year-old vice president of operations. He was holding a folder with my termination notice, a smug grin plastered across his face. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into the USB port, unplugged my physical two-factor authentication hardware token, slipped it into my pocket, and closed my laptop. My silence only seemed to infuriate him more, but he had no idea what he had just done. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to go back exactly 20 years to the winter of 2006. I was 25 years old back then, a fresh graduate with an automation engineering degree and a head full of ideas. Miller Manufacturing Corporation was not the $400 million behemoth it is today. Back then, it was a loud, greasy, and dangerous stamping plant located in the Rust Belt, running on outdated hydraulic presses that hissed and leaked oil onto the concrete floor. Richard Miller, Oliver's father, was a hard-working man who had built the shop from 3 machines. He was 50-something at the time, his hands calloused, and his brow permanently furrowed from worrying about payroll. When I walked into that shop for my interview, the noise was deafening. The old presses were operated manually by workers who had to physically load sheet metal, pull a mechanical lever, and pray the safety guards held. The scrap rate was atrocious, nearly 15%, and the production margins were razor-thin. Richard sat me down in his cramped wood-paneled office that smelled of stale coffee and machine oil. He told me he wanted to modernize, but he couldn't afford the exorbitant licensing fees charged by European automation firms. I proposed a deal. I told Richard that I could write a proprietary software framework from scratch that would integrate the programmable logic controllers, or PLCs, directly with the hydraulic valves and feed sensors. I would design the ladder logic, set up the Modbus communication protocols, and write a custom centralized control database that could predict tool wear and automatically adjust the RAM stroke in real time. But because I was taking a starting salary that was 40% below market rate, I insisted on keeping the intellectual property rights. We drafted an agreement under my newly formed entity, Vance Automation LLC. The contract was straightforward. I would license the software to Miller Manufacturing on a month-to-month basis for a nominal fee. However, the agreement contained Clause 14C. This clause stated that if I completed 20 consecutive years of service with the company, Miller Manufacturing would have the option to buy out the permanent, unrestricted global patent rights for a lump sum royalty payment of $8 million. If the company terminated my employment before the 20-year mark without cause, the software license would immediately terminate within 72 hours, and all operating rights would revert solely to Vance Automation LLC. Richard, desperate to save his struggling business and confident that 20 years was a lifetime away, signed the contract without hesitating. Over the next 2 decades, I lived and breathed that factory. I spent 18-hour days debugging code in the freezing cold of winter and the stifling heat of summer. I watched the company grow from a dirty stamping shop into a massive state-of-the-art facility. We replaced the manual presses with 12 high-speed, fully automated CNC production lines. The proprietary code I wrote, which we called the K-code system, became the central nervous system of the entire operation. It controlled everything from the raw steel coil decoilers to the precision laser cutting heads, down to the automated packaging arms. The scrap rate dropped from 15% to less than 0.2%. Richard was thrilled. He watched his company's valuation soar to $400 million, pulling in $80 million in annual revenue. He treated me like a partner, always relying on my technical expertise to keep the lines running. I knew every quirk of the system. I knew which Modbus registers were prone to buffer overflows, how the thermal expansion of the factory floor affected the calibration of the welding arms during July, and how to patch the database without taking the servers offline. But as the company grew, Richard began to step back. His health was failing, and he spent more time at his estate in Florida than at the plant. In early 2026, as my 20th anniversary approached, Richard appointed his son Oliver as the vice president of operations. Oliver had a prestigious business degree, but had never spent a single hour on a factory floor. He saw the workers as numbers on a spreadsheet, and believed that automation was something you could just buy off the shelf. Oliver immediately hired a team of expensive outside consultants to audit the plant's operational costs. He wanted to make his mark by cutting expenses and boosting short-term margins. It didn't take long for the consultants to flag my upcoming Clause 14C buyout. The $8 million royalty payout was scheduled for December of 2026. To an MBA graduate like Oliver, that $8 million looked like a massive liability that could be easily avoided. He didn't understand that the code running his factory didn't belong to the company. He assumed that because I was an employee, everything I had built over the last 20 years was work for hire, owned entirely by Miller Manufacturing. He didn't bother to read the original 2006 licensing agreement, nor did he consult with the company's veteran legal counsel who had drafted it with Richard. Oliver only saw an aging engineer making a decent salary who was about to cost the company $8 million. He began to create a hostile environment, looking for any excuse to push me out or create a paper trail of poor performance. He started questioning my hours, demanding that I log every minute of my day, and complaining that my technical methods were outdated. I kept my head down and focused on the machines. The 12 lines were running at peak efficiency, churning out automotive components for our largest clients. I knew that as long as the code remained secure on my private server and my physical security keys were in my possession, the company's entire operation was bound to my employment. Little did Oliver know, my patience was not weakness. It was simply the calm before the storm. The tension reached a boiling point in late November of 2026, just 3 weeks before my official 20th anniversary. My father, who was 82 years old and living in a nursing facility just 15 minutes from the plant, suffered a sudden stroke. I received the call from the head nurse at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. My heart sank. I immediately ran to the plant manager, Gerald Peterson, a decent man who had worked with me for 15 years and understood the reality of the shop floor. Gerald, seeing the panic in my eyes, told me to go immediately. He assured me he would monitor the automated lines, including line 4, which had been experiencing minor sensor drift but was running under an automated correction script I had just deployed. I rushed to the hospital, spent the next 2 hours talking to doctors, and signed the necessary emergency consent forms. During that time, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Oliver. I silenced the call as I was in the intensive care unit. He called 3 more times, but I could not answer. When I finally walked out to the hallway, I checked my voicemail. Oliver had left a furious message, accusing me of abandoning my post during a production crisis and threatening disciplinary action. The actual crisis on line 4 had been resolved by my script within 10 minutes of my departure, resulting in 0 downtime and 0 lost revenue. But Oliver had been waiting for a slip-up, and he was determined to use this as his weapon. When I walked into the plant at 7:30 on Monday morning, the atmosphere was icy. Gerald looked at me with a mixture of guilt and concern, whispering that Oliver had spent the weekend reviewing my security logs. Before I could even boot up my workstation, a junior human resources representative tapped me on the shoulder and requested my presence in the main glass-walled conference room on the 2nd floor. I walked up the stairs, my leather boots squeaking on the polished linoleum. Oliver was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by the HR representative and a stack of printed server's logs. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the factory floor below, where 12 automated lines were humming at peak capacity, spitting out thousands of precision-machined brackets every hour. Oliver looked up, his face tight with a synthetic sense of corporate triumph. He didn't ask about my father. Instead, he slammed his hand on the table and accused me of gross negligence. He claimed that my departure on Friday had put a $12 million client order at risk, ignoring Gerald's production logs, which showed that line 4 had met its quota ahead of schedule. Oliver declared that the company was terminating my employment for cause, effective immediately. By citing gross negligence and firing me for cause, Oliver believed he could invalidate Clause 14C, bypass the $8 million buyout, and avoid paying me any severance whatsoever. I sat there, listening to him ramble about efficiency, accountability, and the new direction of the company. I remained completely calm. I asked him if he had consulted his father or reviewed the original 2006 licensing agreement under Vance Automation LLC. Oliver let out a short, condescending laugh. He told me that my little LLC was irrelevant, and that any code written on company computers belonged to the company under standard intellectual property laws. He did not know that the K-code system was registered under my personal patent, and that the server running the compiler was leased to Miller Manufacturing under a strict, non-transferable software license that required active monthly validation. He pushed the termination papers across the table. I read through the document carefully, noting that they were terminating me for cause due to unauthorized absence. I signed the paperwork, adding the words "under protest" next to my signature. Oliver demanded that I hand over my company ID badge and my active security keys immediately. I agreed, telling him I needed to retrieve my personal belongings and my personal laptop from the server room. Oliver followed me down the stairs and into the server room, his expensive shoes tapping loudly on the raised floor tiles. That was when he saw me access the terminal to log out of my active sessions. He panicked, thinking I was trying to sabotage the system, and screamed at me to get my hands off the keyboard. I didn't argue. I simply unplugged my physical two-factor authentication hardware token from the USB port, slipped it into my pocket, and closed my laptop. This token was the only physical key that could access the Vance Automation licensing container. Without that token, the local server could not compile new machine instructions or authorize database updates. The system was currently running on cached credentials, but those credentials had a built-in safety expiration timer of exactly 72 hours. I packed my personal diagnostic tools, my favorite soldering iron, and a few family photos into a cardboard box. Oliver watched me like a hawk, convinced he had just saved the company $8 million and successfully modernized the plant's operations. I walked out of the double doors of Miller Manufacturing, feeling the cold November air hit my face, and smiled. The countdown had officially begun. I spent the rest of Monday at the hospital with my father. The doctors gave us good news. The stroke had been mild and he was already sitting up and talking, his speech mostly unimpaired. I explained the situation to him in a quiet voice, and the old man, who had always valued fair play and hard work, gave me a weak smile and told me to do what I had to do. He remembered the long nights I had dedicated to the factory, and he knew that Oliver had never respected the sweat that built the foundation of his family's wealth. On Tuesday morning, I met with my attorney, Philip Mercer. Philip was a sharp, seasoned lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and licensing disputes in the manufacturing sector. I laid out the original 2006 agreement, my signed termination letter, my patents, and the documentation for the Vance Automation LLC entity. Philip read through the documents, a slow grin spreading across his face. He confirmed that the contract was airtight. By firing me without cause, and specifically doing so to evade the Clause 14C buyout, the company had committed a material breach of the licensing agreement. Under the terms of the contract, the month-to-month license to run the K-Code software was tied directly to my employment status. Since my employment had been terminated, the license was set to expire exactly 72 hours after my official sign-out, which had occurred at 8:30 on Monday morning. Any continued use of the software past 8:30 on Thursday morning would constitute deliberate patent infringement under Title 35, Section 261 of the United States Code. Philip immediately drafted a formal cease and desist letter. The letter detailed the breach of contract, the upcoming revocation of the software license, and the consequences of continuing to operate the 12 CNC lines using Vance Automation LLC's patented technology. He sent the letter via certified mail and also emailed a digital copy directly to Oliver, the company's general counsel, and the board of directors. Meanwhile, back at the factory, Oliver was enjoying his self-proclaimed victory. According to Gerald, who sent me a text message on Tuesday afternoon, Oliver had called an emergency meeting with the board of directors to brag about his cost-saving measures. He presented a slideshow showing that by eliminating my position, he had removed an $8 million liability from the company's balance sheet, boosting their projected fourth-quarter profitability. The board, composed of investors who rarely visited the physical plant, applauded his initiative. When the email from my lawyer landed in Oliver's inbox on Tuesday afternoon, he didn't even read it. He forwarded it to the junior corporate legal team with a note saying it was just a disgruntled former employee trying to bluff his way into a severance package. The legal department, overwhelmed with a pending patent acquisition in another division, filed the email away in a low-priority folder, planning to review it the following week. They had no idea that the threat was not a slow-moving legal lawsuit, but an automated technical countdown. The K-Code system was designed with high security in mind, because the software controlled heavy, dangerous machinery capable of crushing steel with thousands of tons of force. I had implemented a security handshake protocol. The local database containing the CNC tool profiles, calibration offsets, and laser cutting vectors was encrypted. Every 72 hours, the local factory server had to establish a secure handshake with my private, off-site server to renew the decryption keys. This handshake required authentication from the physical two-factor hardware token I carried on my keychain. If the handshake failed for 72 consecutive hours, the local server would assume the connection was compromised or the license had expired. As a safety measure to prevent machine damage or unauthorized software theft, the system would automatically lock the decryption keys, purge the active memory cache, and shut down the PLC communications. I did not have to write a single line of malicious code. I did not have to log into their network, delete files, or plant a virus. I simply sat at my kitchen table on Wednesday evening, drinking a cup of coffee, and watched my private server logs. Around 8 o'clock, the local server at Miller Manufacturing began sending authentication requests. My server, lacking the hardware token's validation, rejected each request with a standard "convocation failed, license terminated" error code. The factory server tried again every 5 minutes, its automated requests piling up in my log files. I went to bed early that night, sleeping better than I had in months. Thursday morning arrived, cold and gray. At exactly 8:30 a.m., 72 hours to the minute after my termination papers were signed, the cached security credentials on the factory server expired. Deep inside the plant's server rack, the K-code container executed its safety protocol. It wiped the active decryption keys from the RAM. On the factory floor below, Line 1 was in the middle of processing a massive batch of steel structural brackets for our primary automotive client. The PLC controller on the main hydraulic press suddenly lost its calibration data, the safety sensors tripped, and the massive 3,000-ton RAM stopped mid-stroke with a deafening metallic hiss. Within seconds, the conveyor belts carrying the raw steel stalled. The automated laser cutters on lines 2, 3, and 4 shut down, their cutting heads returning to their home positions. The robotic welding arms on lines 5 through 12 froze in place, their pneumatic clamps releasing their grip on half-finished chassis. The constant deafening roar of the factory floor, a sound that had defined the last 20 years of my life, suddenly evaporated, replaced by the low, panicked hum of emergency alarms. 12 automated production lines, the lifeblood of a $400 million empire, were completely dead. By 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, the factory floor of Miller Manufacturing was in utter chaos. According to text updates from Gerald, Oliver had arrived at the plant in a panic, his expensive leather shoes kicking up dust as he stormed into the control room. The maintenance team was frantically attempting to reboot the central database server, but every attempt resulted in the same message flashing in bright red text across all 12 operator terminals: leafless expired. Contact Vance Automation L. Oliver was screaming at the IT staff, demanding that they bypass the screen and override the system. But the IT lead, a capable technician named Ronald, explained that the block was not a simple overlay. The K-code software was deeply integrated into the custom firmware of the Allen Bradley PLC controllers on every single machine. To bypass it, they would have to completely rewrite the ladder logic for 12 different production lines, a process that would require reverse engineering 2 decades of proprietary automation programming. Ronald told Oliver that even if they hired the best automation firm in the country, it would take them at least 6 months and millions of dollars to build a comparable system from scratch, and in the meantime, the factory would remain completely silent. To make matters worse, the financial losses were mounting by the minute. The factory operated on a lean, just-in-time manufacturing model. The downtime cost the company approximately $150,000 per hour in lost productivity and idle labor. Furthermore, the contract with our primary automotive client, which accounted for 40% of our annual revenue, carried a strict delivery clause. For every 24 hours that shipments were delayed, Miller Manufacturing was liable for a $250,000 late delivery penalty. Panicked, Oliver called the company's general counsel, demanding that they file an emergency injunction to force me to hand over the source code. But the general counsel, having finally read the cease and desist letter and the original 2006 agreement, delivered a crushing dose of reality. He told Oliver that the contract was binding. The software belonged to Vance Automation LLC. Firing me without cause had automatically terminated the license. If the company attempted to crack the encryption or run the machines using modified versions of my code, they would be open to federal patent infringement charges, which carried triple statutory damages. The general counsel flatly told Oliver that the company had zero legal leverage. At 10:30 a.m., my phone began to ring. I looked at the screen and saw Oliver's name. I set the phone back down on the kitchen counter, letting it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again and then again. By noon, I had received 12 missed calls, 3 emails, and 5 text messages from Oliver, each one growing progressively less demanding and more desperate. The last text message read, "Adrian, we need you to come in. The system has experienced a critical bug. We are willing to pay you a consulting fee of $10,000 to fix it today." I replied with a short, simple text, "Please direct all communication to my attorney, Philip Mercer. I am currently spending time with my father at the hospital." 15 minutes later, Philip received a call from Oliver. According to Philip, Oliver was shaking, his voice cracking as he tried to negotiate. He offered to reinstate my salary and pay a one-time consulting fee of $50,000 if I would plug the hardware token back in and restore the license. Philip listened calmly, then read our terms. We were not interested in temporary fixes. We presented 4 non-negotiable conditions for the restoration of the software license. First, Miller Manufacturing must execute the full Clause 14C buyout of the K-code patent rights for the contractually agreed-upon $8 million. Second, the company must issue a formal written retraction of my for-cause termination, acknowledging that it was a wrongful dismissal and restoring my record. Third, Adrian Vance would be hired as an independent automation consultant for a transition period of 6 months at a rate of $250 per hour with a guaranteed minimum of 40 hours per week. Fourth, Oliver Miller must be immediately removed from his position as Vice President of Operations, as Vance Automation LLC refused to license its intellectual property to any entity managed by individuals who engage in bad faith contract violations. When Oliver heard the fourth condition, he lost his temper, screaming that he would never resign and that he would drag me through court for the next 10 years. Philip politely thanked him for his time and hung up the phone, but the decision was no longer in Oliver's hands. By Thursday afternoon, the board of directors had caught wind of the shutdown. The news that the plant was completely dead had leaked to our major clients, and the company's stock price was beginning to slide. Richard Miller, the founder and CEO, received a frantic call from the chairman of the board while at his estate in Florida. Richard, despite his failing health, boarded a private flight and arrived at the plant by late Thursday evening. He stormed into the executive suite, demanding to know how a simple employee termination had paralyzed a $400 million company. When he read the original 2006 contract that he had signed 20 years ago, and realized that his son had fired the only man who held the keys to the entire operation just to save a buyout fee, Richard's face turned pale. He realized that Oliver's arrogance had brought the family empire to the brink of total collapse. At 8 o'clock on Friday morning, my phone rang once again. This time it wasn't Oliver. The caller ID displayed Richard Miller's personal cell phone number. I answered it immediately. Richard's voice sounded tired, raspy, and older than his 62 years. He didn't start with threats or excuses. He spoke to me as a friend, recalling the cold winter of 2006 when we worked side by side to fix the hydraulic pumps on the old presses. He admitted that he had made a grave mistake by handing the reins of the company to Oliver, whose arrogance and lack of operational understanding had nearly ruined everything we built. Richard told me that the board of directors had held an emergency vote at midnight. Oliver had been officially stripped of his title as Vice President of Operations and was barred from entering the plant. Richard begged me to meet them at Philip's office to sign the agreements and restore the system, explaining that the company was on the verge of losing its primary automotive contract if the lines were not running by Friday afternoon. I agreed, out of respect for Richard and the years we had worked together. At 1 o'clock on Friday afternoon, we gathered in the main conference room of Philip Mercer's law firm. Richard was there, looking exhausted but focused, flanked by the company's general counsel. Oliver was notably absent. According to the general counsel, Oliver had been sent back to Chicago, stripped of his corporate authority and cut off from the family's business operations. Philip laid out the final agreement. The general counsel did not argue. He signed the documents on behalf of Miller Manufacturing. Within 15 minutes, Philip's financial assistant confirmed that a wire transfer of $8 million had been successfully deposited into the Vance Automation LLC escrow account. Next, Richard signed the formal retraction letter. It stated that the company's previous termination notice from Monday was null and void, citing administrative error. It officially recorded that I had retired in good standing after 20 years of exemplary service, making me eligible for full retirement benefits. Finally, they presented the signed consulting agreement, guaranteeing me 40 hours of work per week at $250 per hour for the next 6 months to oversee the transition of the software to their internal IT team. Once the funds were verified and all signatures were dry, I pulled my laptop out of my bag. I plugged my physical two-factor authentication hardware token into the USB port. I logged into the Vance Automation Control dashboard and clicked the button to authorize the licensing renewal key. Less than 2 minutes later, Richard's phone buzzed. It was Gerald calling from the factory floor. Even through the phone speaker, we could hear the distant familiar hum of the machinery starting up. Gerald reported that the database had decrypted, the PLC controllers had loaded the machine profiles, and the 3,000-ton press on line 1 had just completed its first successful stroke. The factory floor was back online. Richard let out a long sigh of relief and shook my hand. Over the next 6 months, I fulfilled my consulting agreement to the letter. I worked 40 hours a week, mostly from my home office, helping Ronald and the IT team understand the nuances of the K-code system. They treated me with the utmost respect, knowing that I was the architect of their entire operation. I was paid an additional $260,000 for my consulting services, on top of the $8 million from the patent buyout. Oliver never returned to the manufacturing sector. Richard, determined to teach his son a lesson in humility, cut him off from the corporate assets and placed him in an entry-level position at a small real estate firm in the Midwest, far away from any decision-making power. As for me, I officially retired in the summer of 2027. My father recovered fully from his stroke, and I purchased a beautiful, quiet lake house in upstate New York, where we now spend our summers fishing. Sometimes when I sit on the deck looking out over the water, I think about the noisy, grease-stained floor of the stamping shop where it all began. I smile, knowing that I didn't have to break any rules or act with malice to win my battle. I simply built something of undeniable value, protected it, and when the time came, I walked away and let my work speak for itself.